Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. My name is Peter Clark and I'm chair of tonight's session. These United States is tonight's title, part of the Big Ideas series within the Melbourne Writers Festival 2008. Firstly, visiting us here in Melbourne, Philip Gourevitch, editor of the Paris Review, which is now, of course, based in the United States, a long-time staff writer for The New Yorker, you may have read some of his articles, and author of several books, including one that's clearly related to tonight's discussion, Standard Operating Procedure, A War Story. The filmmaker Errol Morris was Philip's co-author on that particular book. This is a highly detailed examination of the prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad. Also with us, Don Watson, historian, writer, and former speechwriter, of course, to Paul Keating, who was a keynote speaker earlier in the Melbourne Writers Festival, talked about the eclipse of the United States. That could be one of our themes tonight, I'm sure it will be. And we learn more about that period in Don's life in his Recollections of a Bleeding Heart. Don's latest book, which you'll see out in the foyer and in readings down at the main venue, American Journeys. It's a relatively gentle but insightful look at contemporary America, well infused with Don's love of train travel. It's this year's Age Book of the Year and winner of the non-fiction category as well. And Dennis Altman, Professor of Politics at La Trobe University here in Melbourne. Dennis has been a prolific author with about a dozen books to his name so far, including 51st State, with a question mark, and Gore Vidal's America. Dennis is not long back from another visit to the Americas, including Mexico, and has spent a significant part of his professional life in the United States. His analysis of the US is acute. Please give a very warm Melbourne Writers Festival welcome to our panel. Each of our three panel members will make a very, very brief opening statement, just to get our neurons popping, I guess. Then we'll repair to the sitting down situation, have a discussion, and I want to involve you. Let's welcome our first speaker tonight, Don Watson.
Thank you, Peter. To be brief, I watched most of the, many of the speeches from Denver whenever I could be near CNN, and the strange thing happens, and it only happens when I watch American politicians speak. I get sniffly every time. I got sniffly at Mark Warner talking about the future. And I got sniffly when Hillary spoke and when Bill spoke, and I only saw a bit of Obama this morning, but it was just as well because I may have drowned in my own tears. Now, I think there's a reason for this. But I want to say at the beginning, I don't think, anyone, much less, least of all an outsider, to speak definitively or categorically about America is mad. Now I will speak categorically. I think the reason why we're so moved if we watch American politics like this, and I know other people are moved to throw things at the screen, but I'm not. It is because with all the talk of freedom, with America, so much talk of freedom, there's a counter instinct to periodically huddle, if you know what I mean. And I think what we've seen recently is the huddle of America, and it depresses us all. They go into an aggressive huddle. And when someone like Barack Obama or the Clintons at their best come out and speak about freedom again and about, and we know they talk about it a little too much, but when they start talking about the American dream and what it means, we feel better because the huddle is broken up and America just at least rhetorically becomes what we want it to be. And you get a feeling of deep personal uplift, which in Victoria only football can provide. I said, no, if I can just try and hurry to why I think this. So I've said before, so many times I'm sick of the sound of my own voice, that America presents itself to me as a kind of cousin, that, and in this way, that it looks like us, but once you're there and looking closer, like a cousin, it annoys you because it's so different. That you think you're in the family, but you really realize it's not a family eye you're casting, it's an anthropological eye you need. That Americans It's like a mirror that won't stay stable. So it doesn't look back at you as yourself, it looks back as someone else, and you think, what's going on here? Now, that's the basis of it all. To try and understand it, I think, is so unlikely a task because it is so vast, so diverse, so unevenly developed. It's so denatured that it is so destructive of its own provenance, which is another way of saying it's so creative, that you can't get a sounding easily as you travel around it. It's hard to find the heart of it, except in the rhetoric, or in the flag, or in those symbols of its oneness, which are really denials of the truth, because it is not. Half the time it seems to me like not a country at all, but really 300 million self-regulating souls competing with each other, but held together by a few ideas, and this is the important part. It's the only, I think, the only Western country, and I don't know about the others much at all, which still responds to the idealist conception of history. That is to say, that the first question an historian asks of America, you couldn't ask in a country like this one. It is, how do you relate to God or to the cosmos? Those sorts of questions long went out of fashion here. Manning Clark tried it in Australia to write an idealist version of Australian history, and rather like the early explorers, he exhausted himself in the deserts. He came back with nothing in the end, as materialism took over. Now, the most materialist country on earth is also the idealist country. You watch these speeches, and as an old speechwriter, you would give anything to have the reference points that American speechwriters have. God for a start, because you can then go straight to the King James Bible and all its riches and its cadences. And you can go again to, of course, its foundations and to the Civil War and Lincoln and so on and so on. So you get horrible bastardizations of Lincolnian rhetoric, but it's still got these powerful reference points on which you can hang something. And you can still write speeches about ideas that go beyond the fair go or mateship. You can actually, write an existential speech about what it's like to be alive. Now, on the one hand, these speeches sound it is astonishing how many of them sound the same way. How many American politicians were born in poverty and dragged themselves up? It just defies belief. How many lost one parent and so on. And these things, on the one hand, can sort of drive you a little bit mad, but of course, as I said, you can't be categorical, and you have George W. Bush, who was born with a silver soup tureen in his mouth and managed to get through too. But I guess the serious point I'm trying to make here is that, it is still the last country to inspire, and it is still the last country, for all the, we know there are so many qualifications to be made, but it is still the last country that connects to its founding idea. Even if you can find a million places at which it breaches that, a million examples of hypocrisy and disconnect with that, it still connects in ways with founding ideas that no country anywhere else in the world does, I would suggest. And I'll give you one example, then I'll get off. Take the speech, take Gettysburg, or take Washington's farewell speech as examples, and then take Captain Arthur Phillip's speech at the foundation of European Australia at Circular Quay. Arthur Phillip didn't refer to freedom. He didn't refer really to anything except that men may not visit the women's quarters. And if they did, there would be shocking punishments would follow. That's the difference. Thank you.
Don Watson. Don Watson, thank you very much indeed. And now, our overseas visitor, Philip Gourevitch.
Good evening. Thank you for letting me be the token representative of this strange land that preoccupies you. Does not occupy you. Be glad. It's too far. Don said a number of things that actually speak to some of the things I wanted to speak about. One of the themes that got brought up, and we were sent by Peter this extraordinary list of all of the world's problems. It runs to 2 pages. It includes anything that if you read the headlines on the BBC for the last 6 months, we're responsible for them all, and they're all bad. And in a way, I understand that. America looms very large in the world these days, but nevertheless, the theme is always decline. Is American decline? Are we finished? Have we shrunk? Is China ascendant? And so forth. And in much the way that Dawn was speaking, I keep coming up against the question, what on earth does China offer anybody? What's their big idea? They tell you how to jail writers. They tell you how to crush dissent. They tell you what's the idea? He said the most materialist country on earth is the most idealist. I'm sorry, the most materialist country on earth is a country where communist idealism and communist materialism and capitalist materialism are indistinguishable and feed one another. And there is nothing that can spark the human spirit. Certainly, one can see in China's enormous industriousness all kinds of excitement, inventiveness, capability. But idea, a big, big political idea that can spark human spirit around the world, I don't see it. And I think what's important about America is that it is an experiment, and it is modern, it is new. There is no meaningful idea of American nationalism because we don't hearken back as a nation to anything more than a couple hundred years old. And when you look at Europe, where does Europe fall back when it goes awry? It falls back on a kind of purging nationalism. It starts to cling to its own ideas of whoever it was as a bunch of murderous tribes several thousand years ago who have actually failed to disguise themselves often as anything other than murderous tribes in various incarnations since. And that's the default mechanism. In America, you actually have an idea of citizenship that is totally unique to the world when it was introduced, and has been hard to take hold elsewhere because it's a very unique idea, which is citizenship as entirely one of naturalization, citizenship as a political concept and as a political identity, that nationalism is a political identity, that one belongs to the nation as a member of its polity, as a voter, as somebody in a country where the revolution was imperfect and is ongoing. It just so happens to have been instigated by a group of incredible philosophers and highly articulate people who had a grasp of something that was able, if you go back and you read the founding documents of the country, they continue to inspire and to be wide open and to be open for interpretation. But I think that's important. I think we're talking today because today happens to be the 45th anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. And it's the day that Barack Obama is accepting the nomination of the Democratic Party and gave himself a pretty good speech today in Denver. I'm in the strange position that I imagine, looking around the room, that a lot of you have been in at some point in the last 10 or 15 years of discovering that suddenly here's a guy running to be the president of my country who's my own age. He was born the same year as me, and it feels sort of perilous. You think, wait a minute, are we ready? Aren't there supposed to be some grown-ups around? Isn't there supposed, But the grown-ups have made a disaster of it. And I think, a lot of people, when we talk about decline, look at the country and really are talking about the last 7 years, the years since September 11th. And that it's a relatively short period in history. It's one in which an enormous amount of damage has been done by American leadership to the American ideal and to America's standing in the world. The wounds of September 11th seem to me to be very pale in terms of the wounds inflicted on the country by those who attacked it seem to be very, very small compared to the self-inflicted wounds that the administration and the political leadership in a tremendous executive power grab inflicted on the country in the wake of September 11th, and on the world beyond. And for all the different ways that America is or isn't the defining force in the world and so forth, I think that it is true that it is the place that, if it doesn't lead by example, something is diminished. It is a valuable presence to the rest of the world, and that puts an enormous responsibility on us as American citizens. It's not a welcome thing. And one of the things that always strikes me, because I've done a lot of traveling, is how very differently America appears when you're in America, to Americans, looking at America and talking about America, what it is, what it should be, what thousands of things it is, how incredibly diverse it is, how unnameable it is, and how it looks from without. Americans do not regard themselves with the eyes of the world for the most part. That belongs to a few people who think about these things. For the most part, Americans think about themselves in what in America are called domestic terms. And in election years, it's always interesting because America is very exotic to itself. I know that everybody always likes to go and come back with a story. And whenever I travel, I always make people go, "Oh, I was in Louisiana, and they talked like this, and they fed me crayfish, and it was really foreign, and they had all these funny beliefs and funny music, and they handle snakes in their churches, and isn't that strange and primitive?" It's always interesting to us to discover that a candidate for president who won 75% of the vote in the Republican primary in a number of states is Huckabee, a flat earther, a man who believes in absolutely the most fundamental interpretation of the Bible, who was also one of the most charming and appealing politicians in a very long time to come along. He had obviously kind of great personal appeal, but the country is very, very strange to itself a great deal of the time. And once every 4 years, it kind of reckons with that. And we have this interminable process where people travel around the country and take stock of the rest of the country. They get outside the tiny communities that they live in and the states that they live in and the issues that they live in, and they start to see the rest of it. And they start to have to come together in this way that Don accurately described as a rather teary gathering. Sometimes it's tears of rage, and sometimes it's tears of something deeper, which isn't exactly joy, but it's a sense of common identity amongst a group of people who are really, really very diverse. There is no American national identity that is simple and clean and clear. Benjamin Franklin used to fret about whether the Germans would Germanicize us rather than we Anglicizing them. Seems a long time ago that the idea that these two white groups in the old days were really having to worry about whether they would badly influence one another. The country is constantly absorbing new stock, is constantly absorbing new possibilities of itself. And that really is at the core of something that's very untranslatable about what America is. It's not the only country that's diverse, but it is in many ways the most diverse and the most constantly absorbent, because its idea of itself is based on that. Now, I've just written a book about America at its absolute worst. America betraying its most fundamental ideas of itself, America that had been, in many ways, a leader to the world since its revolution in the way that it conceived of aspects of human rights, not that it didn't violate them, but in the ways that it put forward new ideas about how one might not. And particularly in the revolution, George Washington, actually, the British policy was that when they captured American continental soldiers, they would quarter them. They would kill them on the spot. There was no reason to take a prisoner. A prisoner was a burden. A prisoner ate your food. A prisoner required your soldiers to guard him. So you just killed them. And George Washington said, we're not going to do that. We're going to do things differently. And when we started capturing soldiers, General Washington put out the order, they shall be treated as we would have ourselves be treated, rather than as our unfortunate brethren are treated by the British. This made a tremendous difference. It helped win us, of all things, the support of France. Not that they were really looking to support the Brits, but still, we got the support of a lot of foreign opinion. It made a huge difference in global opinion. It made a huge difference at home in understanding that we were, in fact, up to something new. And this changed not at all over 2.5 centuries. America's idea was always that we would fight wars, but we would treat people reasonably decently. We would do that because it was in our interest. There was an idea of a kind of enlightened self-interest in the way that we would take and treat prisoners, that we were not torturers, that we were a country in which people sought refuge had they been tortured and were fleeing regimes that tortured. That was the rhetoric by which we went to war against Iraq, and it was the rhetoric that we betrayed at every level in the way that we conducted ourselves there and throughout the war on terror. Examining that is, to me, actually kind of a patriotic effort. You look at it closely because you try to understand what afflicts the country, and not because you cynically think, aha, we've seen the real dark heart of America. This is the real dirty truth about the place. But to say, we actually had policies that made sense, and we've now replaced them with policies that harm us in every way. They do not serve our national security. And we are a country that, whether we like it or not, a great deal of who we are and what we stand for at this point is going to be determined in the theater of global public opinion. We affect everybody else's life. Now, as I said, we don't like to think of it that way internally. You go around America and you say, hi, I'm from Australia, or I'm from Mongolia, or I'm from Paris, France, and you know what you guys are up to always makes a difference to me. And the guy's going to say, I run a pharmacy. How does that affect you? I'm sitting out here trying to deal with running a ranch. How does that affect you? I'm a doctor at this hospital. How does that affect you? Yes, I vote a little bit, but how does that affect you? But it does. We've made the music, we've made the movies, we've made the political moves, we've created a political system. I don't say this we, I'm a first-generation American. I can't claim that my ancestors had any credit on this. I came there like most people as the spawn of refugees. So it's not any different for me than it is for most Americans, but I can't claim that this is sort of my ancestors. I'm not a Mayflower American. But I'm telling you that we have this role in the world that is not a role that most of us think about, I think, on a day-to-day basis, that most Americans consciously seek to express. And yet for us to imagine that we're doing anything in the war on terror that's followed from September 11th, other than waging a war for public opinion, is a terrible, terrible mistake. And I think people now might hope, oh, Obama will be elected and it'll all go away. It's not that simple. There's a lot of making up to do. There's a lot of recriminalizing of things that have been decriminalized in the way that we treat others to do. There's a lot of kind of having to prove that we've changed the way that we've understood it. But I think that when it is possible to think on a day when you look back and say, it was so very easy when I was 2 years old and Martin Luther King was trying to get citizenship rights for blacks and voting rights for blacks. In the year that Obama and I were born 2 years earlier, when you look and say that he wasn't really able to drink from the same fountain, use the same public facilities, much less vote regularly in a state like Georgia, and I'm not talking about ex-Soviet Georgia, and now in the Democratic primary he wins 43% of the white male vote. I think it's not time yet to write off the United States as a country in decline, not just materially, but also in terms of its ideas.